Hi friends, it's Andrew Goodall here again with the next in my photography school series where I break down the skills and settings of manual photography into bite-sized pieces you can easily understand. This time it's all about ISO. But before we get started, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button to keep in touch with all the future videos in this series and from my entire world of photography. So, ISO, what's it all about? Of the three settings in the exposure triangle, that is the combination of settings we use to control exposure, ISO is probably the hardest one to explain. That's because it has to do with an electronic function in the camera and not a physical change in the light. Let's do a quick recap on the other settings. Shutter speed is the duration of the exposure. The shutter is like a window, and the longer the window stays open, the more light you have for your exposure. Simple. Aperture is a hole inside the lens. It gets bigger and smaller. The bigger the hole, the more light you have for your exposure. Simple. I've already made videos on both these settings, plus one on how they work together. ISO is a bit more technical, and for someone like me who is not technically minded, it can be a bit hard to explain. So let me try in terms that even I can understand. First up, the term ISO is an historical one from back in the film days. It was a set of numbers adopted by film manufacturers to indicate the light sensitivity of a roll of film. The higher the ISO, the faster the film reacted to light. So if you bought a faster film, you could shoot at faster shutter speeds. If you're old enough to remember how things worked back then, maybe you know a little more about ISO than you thought. I'll begin by saying that in normal circumstances, you're best to shoot at a low ISO number. Just to give you a place to start, I prefer to shoot at 200 ISO, and I think most photographers would tell you the same. Now, let's say I want to shoot a fast action photo on a cloudy day. I'm on 200 ISO, and if I open my aperture as wide as it can go, I can get a correct exposure at a 60th of a second. That's not nearly fast enough to freeze any kind of action. I can set my shutter speed faster, but the photo would be underexposed because I can't open my aperture any wider. This is where ISO comes in. When you set a higher ISO, the camera doesn't need as much light to expose a photo, so you can shoot at faster shutter speeds. If I double the ISO to 400, now the camera only needs half as much light for a correct exposure. And if it only needs half as much light, I can use a shutter speed that's twice as fast, 125th of a second. If I put the ISO up to 800, I can now shoot at a 250th of a second. And if I put it up to 1600 ISO, I can now shoot at a 500th of a second. Now I have a much better chance of shooting a decent action photo. Okay, so that was hypothetical. Here's a real example. I asked a friend to spin this umbrella for me. My first shot was at 200 ISO, and with my aperture wide open, the fastest shutter speed I could get to was a 40th of a second. And you can see how blurry the umbrella is. Then I put the ISO way up to 6400, and I was able to shoot the same photograph at a much faster 1250th of a second. So what's really happening here? Well, it could be compared to adjusting the sound on the radio. If the radio signal is weak, you give it a boost by dialing up the volume. With our cameras, we take a lower level of light and give it a boost by dialing up the ISO. Now, perhaps photos of spinning umbrellas are not high on your list, so here's a more realistic example. This bird shot was taken at 800 ISO and a 500th of a second. That's pretty fast, but it still shows a bit of blurring of the wings. But if I had been at 200 ISO, the shutter speed would have been more like 125th of a second, and I doubt I would have had much of a photo at all. This snake photo was taken indoors under dim light. I had to put the ISO way up to 3200 just to get a shutter speed of only 100th of a second. Now, if I had left the ISO at 200, the shutter speed would have been more like a 1/6 of a second, and since I wasn't using a tripod, there's no way I could have taken a decent photo. So, because most of our photography works best at faster shutter speeds, there are some obvious benefits to being able to change your ISO. And the great news is, if you're shooting in manual mode, which is what this series is all about, it's easier than you probably think. Along with aperture and shutter speed, changes in the ISO are reflected in the light meter, so you still use that to help you find the right exposure. Here's a quick video to show you what I mean. Okay, so now you're looking at the back of my trusty old Pentax camera, and I'm going to show you how this ISO thing works in practice. Now on this camera you can see I've got the shutter speed there. It's currently on 100th of a second, aperture's f3.5, that's my light meter, and it's currently reading underexposed, and my ISO is on 200. The ISO is the number down here. Now
The aperture is already as wide as it'll go, so I've got as much light coming into the camera through the aperture as possible. And if I adjust my shutter speed now till the light meter's in the middle, that brings me to a 1/13 of a second. Now that's not enough to freeze action. It's not even enough to take a handheld photograph. So if I was doing any kind of action or not using a tripod in this situation, I'd already have problems. So I've gone as fast as I can go with the shutter speed, and it's not fast enough at a 1/13 of a second. Watch what happens if I put the ISO up to 400. The light meter immediately goes up into the plus. And now I set my shutter speed faster to bring the light meter back, and that brings me to a 20th of a second. So I already have a faster shutter speed. If I put the ISO up to 800, I can set the shutter speed faster again and still get a correctly exposed photograph, now at a 40th of a second. Let's see what happens if I put the ISO up all the way up to 3200. So that's quite a lot higher. My light meter's gone a long way up, and now I can set my shutter speed to a 200th of a second. So now I would be able to take this photograph handheld, and if there's a tiny bit of movement in my subject, the camera can probably handle that as well. So at 3200 ISO, I've got a photograph that's possible that would be impossible if I was shooting at 200 ISO and a 1/13 of a second.
Okay, so ISO works in seamlessly with aperture, shutter speed and the light meter to help you create a correct exposure. And it's easy to see the benefits of shooting at a high ISO. You can use really fast shutter speeds in almost any light, and you might never have to carry a tripod again. And that raises a pretty obvious question: why don't we just shoot in high ISO all the time? To answer that, let's take a look at what the ISO does from a slightly different angle. To a camera, a photo isn't just a picture, it's a computer file, and light is the information the camera has to process to create that file. When you increase your ISO, you're telling the camera that you still want it to create the file, but you're only going to give it a fraction of the information. The camera does it by grabbing what it can and making up the rest, and you lose something in the process, and the result is a poorer quality image. I said before that high ISO is like turning up the sound on the radio. With a poor quality radio signal, you get static. With high ISO, you get what we call noise. Rather than trying to describe noise, let's take a look at it. Here's the first umbrella photo I showed you before. Remember, it's blurry because it was taken at 200 ISO and a 40th of a second. When you zoom it in, you can see that apart from being blurry, it's a smooth, high-quality image. Now the second photo, taken at 6400 ISO. It's not blurred at all because the shutter speed was so much faster. But when you look closer at this one, you can see a speckly, staticky look right across the photo. I've gained sharpness, but I've sacrificed image quality in the process. Now take a look at one of my bird shots. Yes, the high ISO allowed me to take a handheld photo and possibly freeze a bit of movement from the subject, but on closer inspection, the trade-off in image quality is easy to see. And that loss of image quality is why we like to keep the ISO low whenever we can. When the ISO goes up, you gain something in terms of shutter speed, but you lose something in terms of quality. How much you actually lose varies depending on your camera. Full frame cameras are usually the best for producing low noise images. Crop sensor cameras are not quite as good, but way better than they used to be, and the smaller Micro Four Thirds cameras tend to be a bit noisier than the rest when shooting at high ISO. On the plus side, each new generation of cameras brings with it an improvement in low light performance, so noise is nowhere near as bad now as it was 10 years ago. And of course, noise reduction software can do wonders for improving the quality of a noisy image in post-production, especially if you shoot RAW files. Regardless of what camera you use, the general rule to follow is this: keep your ISO low as much as you can, I prefer 200 ISO, and control your exposure as much as possible using just aperture and shutter speed. There are definitely situations where you have no choice but to increase the ISO, because a noisy photo is still better than a blurry photo. When you're shooting handheld or shooting action in dark conditions, by all means put the ISO up to make sure you get the shutter speeds you need. But don't put it up higher than you need to, and don't just leave it high because it's convenient. Keep it at 200 whenever you can to take advantage of the best image quality your camera has to offer. Remember, you don't have to shoot at an 8,000th of a second, when 1,000th of a second will do. And even when the light is low, if there's no action involved, it's still better to use a tripod. That's what they're for. By the way, you might be wondering why I say to use 200 ISO and not 100 ISO or lower. Well, there's no noticeable difference that I've ever seen in the noise level between 100 and 200 ISO. So if there's no real benefit to shooting 100 ISO, it makes more sense to shoot at 200 and make your life just a little bit easier. Okay, that brings us to the end of a fairly long tutorial on ISO, and I hope for the beginners it takes a bit of the mystery out of it for you. Thanks for watching, and before you go, don't forget to subscribe. I have more stuff on the way for my photography school series that you won't want to miss. For now, I'm Andrew Goodall, this is Nature's Image Photography, thanks for watching.